Andrea Carter is an organizational scientist, a neuroscience-based belonging expert, and a founder and CEO of Belonging First, a consultancy methodology that helps leaders turn culture into a measurable strategic advantage. An adjunct professor in industrial organizational psychology at Ada University, and member of the Forbes Business Council, she spent more than 18 years translating neuroscience and data into practical tools that strengthen comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being at work. Her widely shared article, which is where I first encountered her, "The Price of Belonging is Inconvenience. Are we still willing to pay it?" argues that true belonging requires productive friction and mutual obligation, challenging convenience culture and inviting organizations to rebuild a social infrastructure that keeps communications strong. Andrew's research and advisory work focuses on how belonging can drive performance, resilience, and more humane business decisions. There's a lot there, so I'm going to dive in if that's okay. When you look back over your own life, what early experiences made you curious about why some spaces felt like home and other places feel like you're only fitting in?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me, Andrew. This is a conversation I've really been looking forward to.
Thank you.
I grew up in a family where empathy and belonging was not something that we experienced. Um, and belonging was certainly not something that was built either. And my parents were Eastern European. They survived the Second World War. They were both born in refugee camps and came to Canada with nothing. So there was intergenerational trauma that was truly real, but nobody called it that, and there was no
Right.
language for it. And in our family, everything was very much about fitting in, conform to whoever held authority, do as you're told, do not stand out. Now, the problem was that I couldn't help but stand out. I was 6 feet tall by the time I was 12. My sisters are 5'2" and 5'4". My parents are both under 5'7". There was no version of blending in or fitting in available to me. So, my I actually, there's a family story that I'll share with you here. That my sisters used to tease me that I would never find a man tall enough to marry, and I would always reply to them, "Well, I'm going to find a giant and I'll marry him and I'll have my own giant family where tall people actually belong." And the
Mm.
funny part is that that's exactly what happened. So my husband's actually 6'10", and
Oh my
my
goodness.
son is 6'8", and my daughter is 6'1", and she's 14. So I built the belonging I did not have, specifically, I would say.
So when you have family photos at Christmas with your siblings, it's like it just drops down, does it? I
Well, and
love that.
especially because my youngest sister, whom I'm closest with, she also has two children, and
Mhm.
she's the smallest, so she's 5'2". Her husband is 5'3", and their children are very little as well. And so when we
Um,
come together, it's like this very funny outing
mm,
where we have, giant and the smallest. And so,
mm.
the difference is very much there from a physical perspective, but we've created belonging so that we understand each other on such a different and deep level.
Mm. Did you have any challenges at school being so? Because nobody at school wants to stand out. Everybody wants to just blend in, really. So did you experience any negativity at school to just being different, being taller?
Yeah, absolutely. On my so when we were, I was born in Winnipeg, and we moved to Ontario when I was in grade five. And I
Mhm.
walked into my grade five class, and everyone thought I was the teacher. They couldn't figure out why I was sitting in the front row. And so, the difference of standing out, most people say to you, "Oh my goodness, Andrea, it's so lovely to be tall." And when we walk as a family in an airport, we have people who run in front of us to take pictures of us so that they can show their, friends and family back home how tall this family was. And so being tall, being different, I think for a lot of people, when you don't realize what those repercussions are, travel is very hard. fitting into cars,
Yeah.
clothing, everything has to be custom made for our family. Houses, we have to custom make our houses because otherwise, shower heads, things that you should have comfort in your house, doesn't provide that for you unless you build it. And
Mm.
so I experienced that. My husband experienced that. My husband was greatly bullied when he was, younger. My son, who's also neurodivergent, and daughter have both experienced severe forms of bullying for standing out and being different. And so when I look at that, and I look at that from a tallness perspective, not even factoring in any other intersections of identity. I think those elements are incredibly important for people to realize, because when we're in environments, our environments and how we co-create them is actually really important. And most people grew up in environments that were fitting in, which required you to be 100% to the environment standard rather than co-creating that. So when you grow up with something, you become very precise about what it is and what it's not. And I can walk into a room and feel within minutes whether people belong there or whether they are performing fitting in. Fitting in looks like belonging from the outside, but it's completely different neurologically. And I
Mm.
felt that difference long before I had the science to explain it.
Mm. How would you distinguish belonging from inclusion in the sense of diversity, equity, and inclusion? So it's inclusion presumably is about everybody being accepted and everybody being involved. Is that how do you distinguish that from belonging?
Yeah, so I think that's such a great question. And it actually goes to how I got started on belonging. And
Yeah.
um, if I look back, so I had spent, about 20 years into my career
Mm.
at this point, in performance coaching, and then also working in that DEI world, specifically looking at gender diversity. Organizational development and HR were kind of woven into the kind of bigger part of my career. And I was always drawn to why some teams worked and some teams didn't. But the real turning point happened actually in 2018. And it was before I actually got into the belonging research in a very specific way. And the research I was doing, it's small. It actually still remains unpublished because the supervisor that I had at the time didn't want to publish it because he thought it would be too damaging. But what it showed was, I know, a little
Oh my
laugh
goodness.
there, but what it showed was that despite the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the way DEI was being rolled out would actually polarize our workspaces and our communities, and it would pull them apart rather than bring them together. And that made me ask a completely different question. Not how do we teach people to include each other, but what does the brain actually need to survive and work collaboratively? Because inclusion is a behavior, but the brain actually needs something underneath that behavior to sustain it. Belonging is like food and water. We need it to survive. It's not optional. So when I conducted my first research study to understand what our brains need in order to experience belonging, that research identified 5 neurological indicators. And from there, that's where I went on to measure it in the largest belonging study in the Canadian mining industry. So 3,508 employees across 13 TSX-listed companies, where we validated the indicators and we measured how to create belonging infrastructure specifically. And from then, that was published in 2022, and we're now in 2026, and that research has grown to about 150,000 plus employees over 8 industries. So in 3 years, we can see that there's growth. For me, I also wanted to see that it was validated, not just in, if you think of the mining industry is behind, if you will, in a lot of practices that talk about culture. And so in my mind, I thought, well, is it possible that it only just worked in mining because they needed it so much?
Yeah.
it was a silly thing to, but not in the same breath, because you can take something in one industry and put it into another and it doesn't work. And so I wanted to ensure across industries that we were able to reproduce the same results. So I kind of look at it like, I went from a family where belonging didn't exist to studying why it doesn't exist to proving how to build it.
Mm. That's a fabulous answer. You've gosh, sparked off 10 more questions in my head. I think one of which, first of all, so both my grandfathers were coal miners in the north of England. My dad was a miner, my uncle was a miner. And going back historically, that's what they did. And that was one thing I always struggled a little bit with DEI, not at all because it's not important, it's critical, but I never thought enough focus was given to socioeconomic and upbringing diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can all companies are specialists at presenting themselves in the best possible way. So they say, look, we've got 50% male board members, 50% female board members. Aren't we doing wonderfully well? Which is great. But when you dig in a little bit, you'll often find that both the male and female board members went to Ivy League schools. They went to premium colleges. They both interned at Goldman Sachs or McKinsey. And then they think, well, yes, you're male and female, but apart from that, everything else is the same.
Yes.
Whereas, I left school at 18, didn't go to university, grew up in a small mining village in the north of England, and yeah, so my experience is very, very different, really. And I when you talk about belonging, then, so I worked at two big global corporate real estate companies, both for 5 years, and one of them I absolutely loved, and it felt like I really belonged, and everything about it was comfortable. I had great connection. Using some of your indicators, I felt very safe. My well-being was cared for, etc., etc. The other one, I worked there for 5 years and never really felt that I fitted in. And it was the same. Basically, they were doing the same thing. They were both two of the three biggest global real estate companies in the world, doing exactly the same thing, some number of people, etc., etc. But just something about the feel of the places and the culture, if that's the right word, of the places, just felt very, very different. So one, I felt absolutely I belonged. I found my tribe, found my people, found my place to be. And the other one just never felt that way, really.
Yeah.
So when you created your 5 indicators in the belonging first methodology, so comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being. First of all, how did you, I was narrow it down to those 5, and did any surprises come when you tested those out as your hypothesis for what generated belonging? That's a very long
Well,
question.
so I'll break it down a little bit. So, first of all, the words that we used, comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being, weren't the words that I had started with.
Okay.
The words that we had started with were very much aligned with more of the DEI language.
Mm-hmm.
And what was fascinating about that was that in the early days of because we started, it's a mixed method study, and we started essentially with the quantitative. And what we found was very much like a lot of engagement surveys that you can use these big words and you can validate from a specific sentiment and you'll find your outcomes. But it's not until you actually go deeper into what that means so that people can break it down. And so, it's kind of like, if you don't mind, I'll start with, the concept around your podcast and, empathy as a superpower. So how does empathy fit into what we talk about in a greater structure? And
Mm-hmm.
so the same is kind of true with belonging. So I love the way that you frame empathy, and I want to honor that because empathy matters enormously. I also want to add something to it that I think your listeners will love hearing, because this was actually part of the study as well, is that empathy is what an individual does, but belonging is what environments have to build together as co-creators.
Mm-hmm.
And in my research, empathy lives inside one of those 5 indicators called connection. I'll go into the other 4 in just a minute. But connection is important for empathy because that's where our mirror neurons recognize that the people around us want to know and understand us. And the individual action inside connection is, one of them is empathy, know and be known, trust beyond transaction. But the data also shows that empathy on its own, without the right environment, isn't sustainable. And I think that's what you were noticing between those two companies that you were just describing. Because if your brain is constantly in threat mode, you can't access empathy. So if speaking up with compassion gets punished, empathy becomes a risk. And if there's no recovery structure, the most empathetic people in your organization, in your family, in your community, they burn out first. So empathy is necessary, but insufficient alone. It needs infrastructure to land. And I think that if I look at the research, where the research started with all of the DEI work and where it's evolved to now, the language that we're even using, how we're recognizing, building it is much simpler, because what we've discovered is that language has to travel across country, across language, across barriers. And earlier on, Andrew, what you were talking about was, those intersections of identity. Well, they went to Ivy League schools, or they went to, the top internships. Those are elements of identity. And when we look at how we create environments, you and I are co-creating this environment together. Our listeners are co-creating this environment together. And so what's really interesting is that, if I give you a concrete example, I studied, a manufacturing company. And when I presented the results on belonging, the CFO was like, okay, great, fantastic. But like, how does this actually relate to, our success factors and our productivity? And it was interesting because they had two plants. Plant A, strong belonging factors. So similar to what you were talking about, those two real estate houses, right? So plant A had strong belonging across all 5 factors. Plant B had fractured belonging. Plant A had 12% turnover, so lower turnover, and 82% of their employees, when asked, said that they would go above and beyond no matter what was going on to help the organization through something. So when something went wrong, people spoke up, they collaborated across functions, even like, equipment being down, they would ensure and help each other out. They caught quality issues really quickly because they had belonging. Whereas Plant B, they had fractured belonging. They had a much higher turnover rate, so they were closer to 30%, and only 34% said that they would go above and beyond in that plant. So people didn't flag problems. They felt that it was too risky. Managers had to really push harder to compensate for chaos. So Plant B most certainly had empathetic individuals in it, people who cared deeply about their colleagues. But empathy inside a broken system doesn't fix the system. It burns the people who are carrying empathy out. And you can't empathize your way out of a structure that punishes vulnerability, rewards silence, and keeps brains in a threat mode.
So the different elements that belong to methodology, is it the relationship between the different elements, or is it the absolute score on each of the individual elements that gives you the sort of story you're looking to understand?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because one of the things that we noticed in our first study was that our belonging scores were actually not bad. And averages are a really interesting thing, because averages will hide.
A multitude of sins.
Right? Yes. Averages hide everything. That's why when you look at, a compilation of people in an organization, and you don't account for their education, and you don't account for their role, and you don't account for whether they are, married or single, or a single parent, or any of these other factors, or you don't account for what languages they speak, or whether they're taking care of parents or other people, and so there's all of these factors. And what we found in our initial study was that the averages, what we laughed at, it's not really funny, but what we laughed at was that a lot of our mining CEOs and CHROs said, well, the data's not that bad. We're not that bad with belonging. Their scores were, kind of low 70s, somewhere in the low 60s. And we hadn't looked at how to mediate the intersections of identity. So when you look at averages, and the same is true for a lot of survey data, is that, they'll look at an engagement survey and go, oh yeah, we got, a decent score. Anything between a 70 and a 75 is kind of considered average and good. Well, if you were to actually factor in, what function or position or team or any of those intersections of identity that I just talked about, you actually find that you have your average, but then you also have a score that applies to the people outside that average. That's the gap we measure when we go into organizations. So yes, we provide you with your initial benchmark, but then let's look at who the people are, because that's where you find where things are breaking. And you can't actually determine what's going on in an organization unless you're looking at what's breaking the system underneath, underneath the surface layer, if you will. And I think that what we found specifically was that, and have continued to find this, is that a lot of executives will say, well, I don't really want to reveal the data. It's bad. And my response to them is, well, let's be honest. Your people already know it's bad. They've told you this. It's whether or not we are going to do something about it. And that comes down to that infrastructure that I'm talking about. And so when we look at the 5 indicators of belonging, there's 5. We've already talked about them. And would you like me to go through them now, Andrew, just to give your audience a bit? Yeah. So when we talk about comfort, well, first let me say this. So I just want to remind people that belonging says, show up as you are, and we're going to build something together. Whereas fitting in is passive, it's conditional, it's transactional. It says, adjust yourself to what we already are, and if you do so, we'll let you stay. Okay, so just understand those are fundamentally neurological differences. So a brain that's fitting in is in chronic low threat level all the time. It's constantly scanning. What do I suppress? What do I perform? What do I hide? And that takes an enormous amount of metabolic energy. And this is where those 5 indicators come in, because they describe what the brain needs in order to move out of the threat state and into a belonging state, which is actually where you use a lot less energy when you belong. So that means that you're actually more productive and you actually perform better. So the first thing that the brain needs is comfort, and not comfort like a soft chair, not comfort like we're going to be nice here. Everybody knows what a nice environment is, as I do air quotes. Comfort means your brain is able to come out of threat mode. It means that you can see friction, you can see conflict, and you're at ease to actually handle it, okay? It means that in order to have that, you know what success requires from you to do. You know what you need to act on. There is clarity and there's predictability. And that doesn't mean that you have to be able to predict everything. It means that you have to have clarity on key factors so that your brain knows what to do, so that your cortisol drops. When we don't have those things, there's an area of the brain called the amygdala, and it essentially hijacks all of your cognitive resources. So you can't actually focus on work if you're scanning for danger. Your brain can't do both simultaneously. And without comfort, none of the other indicators become possible because your nervous system is in alarm mode. So if we think about it from an empathy perspective, when you're in alarm mode, your empathy is essentially neurologically offline. So once comfort is present, the brain can access connection. Connection is the second indicator. This is actually where empathy lives. Connection means that your brain recognizes, that the people around you want to know you and understand you, and you want to do that back with them. So you have mirror neurons that are activated, oxytocin, which is your bonding hormone, flows. You start to build mutual trust, responsibility, and accountability. So trust beyond transaction. And this is where, when you're in friction or conflict, you're actually bonding together so that you can make it through that conflict rather than fracturing. So the critical thing about connection as an indicator is that it requires more than one person being empathetic. It requires organizational conditions or environmental conditions, because it's not just within an organization. You can do this within a family. You can do this within community. You need these conditions where relationships of real depth are possible. Time, proximity, permission to know people beyond their job title. The third indicator is contribution. And contribution means that your brain activates and mobilizes because your work matters, you matter, what you're doing in that space matters, and there is evidence of it. So dopamine drives the motivation, this matters. Serotonin provides fulfillment, I matter. Together, they essentially produce the energy to push you through difficulty. And if you don't have both of those, you actually will not keep pushing. Eventually you'll go, okay, been there, done that. You asked me to push before. You didn't show me where I was important. You didn't show me that I mattered. You didn't show me that my work actually made an impact. So because I don't see evidence, I'm not going to keep pushing for you. And then when we look at contribution is also really important from the lens that when we don't see our contributions, people really stop investing in other people. So not just in tasks, but in the consideration of other people. And we can see where, from an empathy perspective, you actually need a surplus of empathy to then create the energy that the brain requires so that you have something left to give. So when contribution breaks, it's like there's nothing left. The fourth indicator is psychological safety, and this is the one that protects empathy. So psychological safety means that your brain registers safety and you can remain willing to speak, try, admit, challenge without fear, or specifically without fear of social punishment. That can be workplace punishment, that can be familial punishment. But in organizations, a lot of organizations have spent millions of dollars on psychological safety. Our research showed that it was really only 1/5 of what you need in order for your brain to recognize belonging. And so in those organizations that reward conformity, call it culture, empathy is at risk. So is psychological safety, because showing any sort of vulnerability in an environment like that is a risk. Speaking up for someone is a risk. And so psychological safety determines whether empathy survives or whether we suppress it. And so without it, the empathetic thing to do might also be the career-ending thing to do. And people learn that very quickly. So when we look at the fifth indicator, which is well-being, well-being means that your brain has the structure to recover. And if you look at how much, again, millions of dollars being pumped into resilience training, I always think it's, laughable in the way that it's like, okay, here's a well-being app, Here's, access to some psychologists. Here's all of the things that you can go do. Now go out there, fix yourself. And when you're better, you can come back, and
Yeah.
good for you, and we'll accept you again. And this actually isn't how well-being works, and how resilience works. And we know that based on all of the data where we've looked at natural disasters, because people who have social networks of well-being, where well-being is there as a community getting better together, recovering together, those people recover 40 to 60% faster than somebody who is sent out on their own to recover. So when we look at the structure of what's happening, whether that is in a family, a community, or an organization, when that whole person is not considered, when you are meant to push through things, you're meant to engage in friction and conflict, but there's no growth. When you're meant to engage in friction and conflict, but there's no recovery. If you look at performance with athletes, we know that we have to build recovery into performing at our optimal, our top levels. Well-being is the same. For our growth, we need to have periods of friction where things are hard, but then we also need to have periods of time where we go into recovery. And so well-being really acts as a sustainability layer, if you will. Without it, all of the other 4 indicators will degrade over time. And the people who are most vulnerable to that degradation are the most empathetic people in the organization. And because they're feeling everyone's experience on top of their own, research also stresses that there's actually a really great study. Sorry, it just popped into my brain. Decity and Jackson. And they actually show that feelings of another pain can be felt so acutely that it actually becomes your own and depletes your own system. So what's fascinating about that and mirror neurons and being in environments is that whatever is happening in your environment has a direct impact on what your performance is and on how much you grow. And without recovery infrastructure, empathy will burn itself out. People will burn themselves out. So these 5 indicators, comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being, they form an interdependent system where comfort's the foundation, connection and contribution reinforce each other to keep moving through bonding, activating, motivating. Psychological safety protects, and then well-being sustains. So when you pull one out, it's not that the whole thing fails, but it's certainly not as sustainable. When you improve one, the other 5 begin to improve as well.
Yeah. No, I like the way you describe the interconnectivity of each of them and understand. I think that's what really makes this distinct, is that it's about, ultimately it's about a relationship between everything, and between you and your workplace, and you and your colleagues, and you and your peers, etc. Just thinking about, and it feels like almost a lifetime ago now, but thinking about a few years ago when we had COVID, and forgive me, I'm not quite sure what the regulations were in Canada, but certainly in the UK, we were basically told on a Friday, grab your laptop, take your power cable, go home. We put it back in 2 weeks. And 6 months later, we were still working at home. And since then, I think the average in the UK now is 3.2 days a week in the office, 1.8 days a week working from home or working remotely. I wondered whether working remotely makes belonging more difficult, whether it's something you need to be in physical proximity with people to be able to achieve efficient. But I guess with lots of companies, I used to have a team that was spread all around the world. Some people I've never ever met, and you want them to feel they belong as well as people you're sat next to. So how have you found, or what are your thoughts about remote working versus working in a dedicated location with other colleagues?
Well, it's fascinating because we actually did a study. I published a chapter in a book on this and on building a community of belonging remotely. And What I'll start with and say that there's two really important studies that were just released. So the World Happiness Index was just released on
Yes.
the Global Happiness on Global Happiness Day, and then just recently the Workplace Happiness Index was just replaced, and I was asked to be a speaker at that release at Google headquarters in London. And what was fascinating was that Lord Richard Layard, who of course is an economist, Oxford, has really made an incredible impact on well-being in the world, and the research and the studies and the infrastructure around that. And what he was showing in his research was that our youngest generations used to be the most happiest. So it used to be like a U shape, right? So your least happy point used to be in midlife, and then it would get better. And it's now a J shape, which is incredibly concerning. And part of that is that we do not have the belonging infrastructure where there is proximity to understand how people build relationships. What was also fascinating from his research was that he actually indicated that employees experience their workplace as a relationship, whereas organizations experience it as a transaction. And so when we look at that and we look at our young people coming into the workforce, the research doesn't show that it's proximity based necessarily, where you have to be in physical presence. It means that you have to have some of these inconveniences to understand what is important to another. So let me break it down from a perspective of belonging. Comfort. Right now, we have all these other tools to communicate with each other. So, you have Slack, you have Teams, you have email, you have text, you have WhatsApp, you have Snapchat, you have social media. Like, we have all of these ways of communicating. And what's fascinating is that if you go into most organizations, most employees are working on 5 or 6 communication channels rather than 1 or 2. And that becomes incredibly hard on your brain because you never know where the information is coming in from. So then when somebody misses key information, or you miss information flow, or you miss something important, that blame resides on the individual who missed it, rather than actually looking at the structure of what was creating comfort for communication in the first place. So it's as simple as sitting down and saying, okay, what's everybody on this team, maybe there's 5 of us on this team, and you do this as a bigger exercise as well with a bigger team. It doesn't matter if it's 5 or 100. What is the ways that we are going to successfully communicate? What is the one channel that we will rely on and we will check X amount of times per day? And the agreement of that is actually what allows the brain to feel comfortable enough to go, okay, I can go do my work, because I know if I check this X amount of time and I check this one space, and we're all accountable and responsible to this one space, we will all have the information that we need. My brain can come out of threat mode, and I can actually start connecting much more efficiently. So when we look at just comfort as an indicator there, that element is actually much more important. Those 5 indicators, regardless of how you're deploying them, all come together on how you are co-creating the environment together. And because of COVID, everyone was sent home. It's like well-being. Everyone was sent home and told you can talk to 5 people or whatever it was in each of the countries, but you essentially had pods, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you were allowed to integrate with others and not with others, and so it was this crazy social experiment where what's fascinating is that another paper that I actually wrote was about isolation and loneliness and the impact of that post COVID, and the levels of estrangement that have since occurred from everyone going into isolation. The brain fundamentally changed. Everyone's brains fundamentally changed because we were in isolation and we need people so much. So, isolation leads to negative assumptions, and we actually can track it through the US. We actually can track isolation and a lack of belonging to school shootings and the impact of that. So we know that isolation leads to violence. It leads to negative perceptions about people. It actually changes how we interact. And so we had all of these children who were isolated on their own, and their only form of connection was social media. And what's fascinating about that is that the social media that the children are on is actually more impactful. What their friends are looking at, what they are looking at, actually creates, it co-creates the experience. And so not all social media they're finding is necessarily damaging. It's what your friends and what the people that are closest to you are also participating in that impacts the damage or not. And so when we look at, back to your original question, so I'll circle back. But back to your original question, I feel that autonomy and co-creating belonging is actually more important than having just a set amount of time in the office, not in the office. I do believe foundationally that we can have remote work, but what we know is that we still have an interdependence on human beings. We are human beings. We need people. And so how we create that, I'm sure, and the research showed this, we bond faster when we are in closer proximity. However, we can still bond if we are remote. The bonding changes, though, and requires much more inconvenience. So what that means is you need to be on more video calls. You need to be doing more social interactions. You need to be checking in with people's well-being. You need to be doing things where you're actually factoring in the whole person, not just who they are from a work perspective. We need to be considerate of those other indicators of identity. And so we didn't get those right necessarily during COVID. And I think that that's where a lot of our fracturing of that has come from.
And you did mention loneliness in something you said then, and that's one of the things I sort of get a bit challenged by, I guess, because and you said before that there are so many ways that we have now to be able to connect with anyone. You're in Canada, I'm sitting here in England, and we're talking. I can see you, can see me. We can hear each other, so we're connected in a way that the generations past never had that. But you could write a letter, and that was about as far as it went, really. Then we had email, then we had smartphones, then we have video conferencing, then we have avatars or whatever. So in sort of practical and theoretical terms, we can connect with anyone anywhere in the world, really. But most of the research suggests that, and it might be too bold a title, but suggests we're in a loneliness epidemic where people have fewer friends than before, they have more shallow relationships, they struggle to connect with people in real life. And I wonder why would that be if we are able to connect, or we have the technology to be able to connect in a way we've never been able to before? But almost conversely, we're experiencing more loneliness than ever before.
Well, and I think I would argue it's one of the reasons is because we're trying to recreate fitting in cultures rather than creating belonging cultures.
Okay. Yeah.
And so when we look at belonging, belonging is not just one way. So in environments, most people go into environments and they expect the environment to provide everything to them.
Mm-hmm.
And in that environment, that is an expectation of fitting in. You are then saying, okay, well, if I am going to expect you to give me everything, then I have to adhere to your fitting in conformity. Belonging doesn't operate from that perspective. Belonging means that you're going in, I'm going to give you, Andrew, 50% belonging. So I'm going to make sure that I create conditions of comfort, connection, contribution, psychological safety, and well-being for you,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that you're then going to reciprocate and be responsible and accountable to creating 50% for me. It means that we are in this together, truly. And it means that I'm considering all 5 of those indicators to ensure that you can perform at your best and that you can feel at your best. And we don't do that. And so when we look at loneliness and when we look at ostracization, when we look at how we cut people out, those elements, cancel culture as is an epidemic, because what it's doing is it's saying that if you don't get the wording right, or you don't get we can't make mistakes, we can't say things without extreme harsh judgment where you could be condemned and then ostracized. The human brain cannot operate in isolation. And so ostracization is the worst thing that you can do to a human.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at that, and when we look at the levels of loneliness, the levels of estrangement, the levels of mistrust, the levels of ostracization that cancel culture has driven, what it's showing is that it's showing where we have not continued to give belonging or show up for another human being, but we've essentially written them off because they are inconvenient and they no longer operate the way that we do. And, before we got on to our call today, one of the things that you said is, I'm a very curious person and I'll just ask you questions. And I love that. I absolutely, I think that when we have conversations like this, they're definitely more rich and people get more out of them. I think that we have lost our capability to be curious and to stay committed to being in a belonging relationship with people that we are connected to. And whether that is in an organization at work, whether that is family, whether that is community, what we're not doing is we expect everyone to adhere to us rather than looking at what am I giving back. And we don't actually have language to actually identify that. And so one of the things that we did this year was very simply create, a quick diagnostic tool so that people can identify, am I giving comfort? Am I giving connection, contribution, psychological safety, well-being? And am I getting this back from someone? So, you have to think of one person that you're in a relationship with where you feel that there's something fractured or it's not working well. And it's a very simple diagnostic tool. It takes you, it's 10 questions for you, 10 questions for the other person, but it essentially provides you with this is your score on belonging. This is what you're giving. This is what they're giving. And what we found fascinating about it when we first launched it was that the majority of people will actually overscore themselves. And so that's essentially how our world is right now. We always think we're better than what the other person is, right? Yeah. But the fun part is that if you do the assessment and then you have the person that you're in the relationship do the assessment and you use the language that's in the actual assessment, you end up finding out questions about how is it that I'm missing the mark on comfort for you? And having that dialogue is very different, where you look at it like, I am giving this, but maybe I'm not giving it in a way that you actually appreciate or that is considering what you're going through. So how do I do this better? And I think those are the conversations that we need to start having. It's a free diagnostic tool. So it's just on belongingfirst.com/belonging breakdown. So feel free to use it. What I do find is that the conversations, the curiosity, the question, those are the elements within the infrastructure that we need to start caring about again, because it is, the environment certainly has changed. I think that organizations have spent decades optimizing efficiency, removing friction, rewarding conformity, calling it culture. There was a really interesting study that was actually just released at the beginning of January of 2026. And the thing that made it fascinating to me was that they were measuring empathy across 3 generations of AI models. Okay, so look, we're talking about empathy being built into AI models. And what was fascinating about this was that it was, thousands of users were actually protesting that the newer models of AI were losing their empathy or had, they had lost their empathy. And so there was this hashtag that was created. It was a big, pushback. And essentially what a UK clinic did was they measured it, and they scored, I think it was 2,100 responses across 6 psychological safety dimensions. And the finding was that empathy was statistically identical across all 3 models. It hadn't changed at all. But what had changed was the infrastructure around empathy. So crisis detection, advice, boundaries, consistency. And I think the title of the paper is called Empathy is Not What Changed. So check that out if you'd like. But the same thing is happening in our organizations and in our families. So empathy is not what's changed. The environments that allow empathy to function are what have changed. And I would say that that's exactly what my belonging research measures and then helps create. Because I think that, the premise from that study is right. And I think what you are talking about with this podcast is incredibly important. Empathy matters. And I think that every home needs empathy. I think that every organization needs empathy. And I think, based on what I'm seeing in the research, that without belonging infrastructure, empathy has nowhere to land. And so, that study that I just talked about was really interesting to me. It really struck me because the older AI model had a high variance, similar to what I was talking about, where averages hide real meaning, right? It would occasionally produce a moment of extraordinary emotional depth. And users would remember that moment. They formed attachment to the moment of high empathy. But the same model was missing, crisis signals. And so those failures were invisible because the person in crisis is not in a position to evaluate whether their crisis was detected. And so peaks are always remembered. The failures are silent. And that's what happens in families and organizations, in culture, and in community. The performative culture moments get remembered. The town hall, the engagement score that looks strong, the holiday party, those are the peaks. But the belonging failures are silent because the people experiencing them have already disengaged or left because it's not safe for their brain to actually perform. And they're not in the room to tell you what you missed. So
And
go ahead.
and yeah, no, just gonna say it's interesting when you're talking about the almost the need for friction and for sometimes having to put the effort in some ways, if that's not too simplistic a way of putting it. And I think a lot of the tools that we're sort of talking about have, I guess, intentionally remove that friction and that difficult. And I can remember when I first left home at 18, a long time ago now, I'd ring my parents, talk to them on the phone, and we'd chat and we'd talk, whatever. And then over time, I'd still ring them, but then I'd text them and I'd message them and I send a picture or a thumbs up or whatever. So yeah, of course I'm still in touch with them. I'm still talking to them, but actually over time, sort of thinking, almost forgetting. Well, actually, I'm just texting. I'm just sending a text, sent, gone, and I'll check the phone, in a few hours' time to see if the text back or whatever. But almost I was, using these new technologies almost as an excuse for not not intentionally, not having that conversation, not having that difficult conversation, that pleasant conversation, that whatever. I would just send a text and that would be it. So I think that takes away a lot of the necessary friction that you talked about that increases that sense of belonging, that need to put an effort in from both sides, and not to make it just about fitting in. And you touched on AI. Obviously, I think it's compulsory to mention AI now in any podcast. And I wondered what your thoughts are on, so as we are slowly or quickly bringing AI into the workplace, AI is taking on some tasks, AI in some places taking on some roles. AI, and as you read some papers, AI is almost becoming, and it's the wrong word, I know, but almost becoming a teammate in a way. How does that impact people's sense of belonging when there's an AI coming into the business as such?
Well, I think it's very much about how it's rolled out.
Yep.
AI, I think, can absolutely support people so that they don't burn out as quickly.
Hmm.
I think that there's a lot of really wonderful pieces around it. However, what we know is that AI, when you remove the human element of AI, um, and how we also give to it. So AI is also on a belonging model in that we give it 50%, it gives us 50%. Now, I know that that's a little bit, not entirely mathematically correct.
No,
But
that makes complete
you
sense.
are only, your AI is only as good as what you provide it.
Yeah.
And, I while I was over in the UK, no, this is actually when I was in Belgium. I had this crazy email that came to me while I was traveling, and it was one of the companies that I have consulted for in the past. They decided that they were going to launch micro learnings
Hmm.
for their DEI platform, and they were going to use AI to craft these micro learnings. So, they used very expensive AI. Great, wonderful. But the person who was actually putting in the details did not actually know the history. Now, this is a Canadian, the specific place, it was regionally launched in Canada.
Hmm.
And all of the information was a mixture of US identity, US history, rather than Canadian history. Now,
Mm.
we're in a geopolitical time where if we don't know our own history,
Yeah.
there's a problem. And so when you're looking at heritage months, for example, which are incredibly important for organizations to have
Hmm.
access to, and everybody should have access to information. But if that information doesn't actually reflect the origin that people are localized in, then you are always going to have problems. And so for this specific micro learning, they had almost their entire organization up in arms, being like, what are you doing? Let's just get rid of all of this work. And it wasn't that the work was bad, it was that the individual didn't have the understanding or the knowledge to know that a tomato is a fruit, but a tomato doesn't go in Fruit
Fruit
salad.
salad. Yes.
Okay, and so I know that's a really, I've
Yeah.
really simplified that analogy, but that irks people. That angers people, and that's where we end up going wrong with AI a lot of times, because you're relying on AI to provide you all of the data without you having the knowledge of putting it in first. So, what I feel happens with AI and where it works really well is that if you put that data in and it computes something that you've already been working on, and then you have
Mhm.
a conversation about it, fantastic. You're actually then creating belonging, not only with the AI, but also with your organization. And you're presenting it in different ways that people can build on and innovate. But if you're only using it as a diagnostic tool, it will fail you time and time again.
It's amazing, isn't it, how some of those to some people, something that was seen quite small can have such a massive impact. I remember in one of the companies I worked for, one of these big real estate players, they roll out sort of global training, mandatory training we all like to do, which it's mandatory, we have to do it. And generally within the first, because it's an American company, generally within the first 2 minutes, some incredibly irrelevant Americanism or something that was completely counterintuitive to the UK or to Europe or to wherever else would come in, and then you just tune out for the rest of it. It might be really important training, but you just sort of sit there and think, okay, click, yeah, what have I got to click? And you would have no idea what you're doing. But because they're just focused it purely on them, first of all, it makes you think, well, okay, all they care about is their home market. We don't matter to them. Secondly, it's just very obtuse that they haven't necessarily thought about the nuances and some of the challenges that they're facing, particularly, and I'm sure now even more so with the global challenges we're facing. But it is interesting how little thought is given to that, and that almost creates the opposite of feeling like you belong or sense of belonging, because they've put so little effort into helping you feel that you belong and you're part of that business. Therefore, you don't want to give anything back. So that almost creates, almost the opposite to what they're trying to achieve. Whatever the opposite of belonging is. That is interesting. Something that doesn't feel like such a big thing. I'm sure when they're creating it, and it's standard training, it's global, but then when they roll it out, recognize that but they're in 75 countries. Some of those feel differently about other countries than others. It's really challenging. So you've been very generous with your time, and I don't want to take all day, but just a couple more quick questions, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Go for it.
So one of which would be that obviously when you go into companies, it's wonderful that they call you in, but it's often that they believe or feel they have a challenge or an issue, or the company is in transition, or worst case, in some sort of pain. I wondered how you manage to protect and nurture your own well-being, so you don't carry away with you the sort of negativity that you've encountered at the businesses you work with.
That is such a great question. And, I love that you've brought it up, Andrew, because it's certainly, when I initially started this work, um, I would say that I wasn't aware of how much I was giving
Yeah.
to an organization until I started to burn out.
Hmm.
And I've always been a high performer. I've always been someone I love work. I love research. I love people. Um, my husband and I always joke about the fact that I'll be working into my 80s because I love it so much. And he's like, I'm retiring at 60. Right? His family comes from a long line of men who didn't retire until they were in their 70s, but he's like, I'm retiring early. And I think the work is one that what I've had to really recognize is belonging is 50-50. And so in an organization, any contract that I now take, if you are not giving me 50%, if you are not showing up for me, or if you are using me as your performative answer to fix your hurt or fix what your people feel is a really big culture gap, and you're not going to put that work in, then that's not a contract that I'm going to sign up to take. And
Yeah.
so, in December actually of last year, and I do this every year. I kind of I look at the organization and I look at if they're giving 50%. And if they're not, that is my time to say, thank you so much. This has been an amazing experience. I have learned a lot because I always learn, regardless of the experience, I always learn a lot. Um, and I am going to move on to my next contract. And
Hmm.
so usually, I work with organizations for about 3-4 years. Um, and that has always been really wonderful. Where they start showing up, that is a red flag for me so that I continue being able to do great work. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm just leaving them high and dry. I've created a lot of learning management um, resources. So lots of online training, micro learning. That was one of the things that one of the that Canadian company was like, can we please just get access to your work? Um, we know that it's Canadian. I have done it for Canada, for the US, and then also for the UK.
Hmm.
I haven't managed to get into all of Europe. That would be extremely um, time consuming, I think, but very relevant. At some point, somebody will want to. Now, what I will say on that is that in having those resources, it means you can still have access to my content, you can still have access to what I do, but you don't have access to me.
Yeah.
And that has actually been a really important way for me to protect my own empathy and what I am giving. Um,
Hmm.
I think that there probably was a time where I questioned whether or not belonging would actually move the dial enough for me to feel like I could do that. But after being in, 8 industries, seeing the transformation in the past 3 years and how fast that happened, I now feel very confident in being able to say, if you're not showing up for me and for this work and for what we're co creating and for your employees, we are just not a fit. I don't believe in performative culture. And so that very much is one of the ways that I look at my contracts. The other
Hmm.
way is that I'm also very conscious of the belonging that I'm giving to myself, my
Yeah.
values, what I'm showing up for myself with. And,
Hmm.
again, looking at that 50-50, like what is the impact of me on an environment? What
Mm.
am I then creating or showing up for with my children and with my family?
Hmm.
I come from a very broken family, and I always knew that I wanted to be a mother. I always knew that my children would be incredibly important to me, and that in order for me to have a great relationship with them, I needed to be there for them, and they need to be there for me. And if I don't have that time to give them, I know that there's an imbalance that is very problematic. That doesn't suit um, what I want in my lifestyle.
So what one of the I guess one of the wonderful things is that when people want to engage with this, they engage with you, and you're a key part of what they're buying into, etc. But would you certify other people or to in the belonging first methodology to sort of scale it out more across Europe or across APAC or whatever? Because obviously you can't travel 400 days a year, you can't work 25 hours a day. So yeah, is how do you go about almost sort of franchising it in a way, I guess?
Andrew, I love that question because you are, I don't even know what number who has asked that of me at this point. It's in the works. It's
Okay.
for me, I needed to ensure that I could validate it across industry before
Yeah.
building out um, a viable product. And I'm a firm believer that, and maybe I double down too much on research. Maybe I'm too precise. but I do feel like there's a cost of getting it wrong. And so I needed to get it right enough to
Yeah.
have the validity behind it. And
Hmm.
so I have a book coming out this year. With that book,
Well,
the
thanks.
workbooks will follow.
Hmm.
And then from there, the plan is to essentially franchise and train people in the methodology so that I am not the sole provider. And essentially, when I go into organizations, I do the same. I do a bit of a train the trainer program for
Yeah.
their internal people. And so
Hmm.
that works well. But the recognition of how many people are asking me if there's a way that they can be certified in it or licensed in it, that certainly is a demand.
Yeah, we can hold the rod, can we? If everybody's saying it now, and there's such huge power in having access or basing the work on 150,000 interactions with people. Because building that data set and be able to understand the data, cut the data, work with the data, that's so valuable. So then my final, you've sort of partly answered it, I guess. My final question would be, apart from promoting the book and working on the workbooks, whatever, what do you have a view as to what the next 5 years look like?
Well, I've just had to sit down and look at my strategic plan, Andrew.
Oh, nice.
So I'm at a place now where there's kind of a couple things that I'm looking to do. So first is I'm looking to create some strategic partnerships so
Hmm.
that I can grow the methodology within a few larger organizations so that they adopt it, take it on, really grow, measure the data over time. And then there's also some researchers that I'm looking to partner with as well, again, to continue growing that database and our publication schedules. So the partnership model is certainly something that we're investigating on a bigger scale. Um, Looking at also then having accessible the SCORM files, the ways to get access to the information without needing me to come in,
Yeah.
and then also doing more speaking engagements. So um, for the longest time, I was very happy with being the best kept secret within a lot of the organizations. I've had a really incredible mentor and also a very important champion who has continued to push me to grow. Um,
Hmm.
I was always very happy, just being in my little space. I think growing big is a very uncomfortable feeling. Putting yourself out there is uncomfortable, and so for me, that growth is certainly in place, and I'm looking forward to doing more. I always look for essentially 3 projects per year that I can really partner with. So those are in place, but I'm recognizing that only 3 really minimizes the impact that I can have. So lots to come. The big
Mm.
push right now is to get the book and the workbook out, um, because that will obviously provide much more access to the
Yeah.
information, and then also have the ability to link into some of the tools and
Hmm.
systems that we have that are built on our back end that the average person can't access just yet.
Mm.
But certainly, it is an ongoing strategy that we're hoping to, really launch and grow bigger in the next 2 to 3 years.
So what stage is the book at? It's written, it's finished, it's
We're
got a
close. We're
date.
close to being written. So I would say we're
Okay.
we're like 85%.
Okay.
There's a couple of tweaks that I want to make,
Yeah.
and it's really fascinating with publishers and editors these days, because the other factor is that they want you to have a certain amount of LinkedIn followers and Substack followers and all
Yeah.
of these things
Yeah.
before you
Yeah.
publish. And you know, it's when you go with a traditional publisher, you have to follow their lead. And I wanted my first book, even though I'm published in multiple books,
Hmm.
um, I wanted my first book on belonging to be with a traditional publisher. And we'll see where it goes from there. I actually see that there's a series that I will put together, because I do feel that our education system needs belonging infrastructure. We certainly need to look at belonging infrastructure in families and in communities. And so looking at how to create that, it can be a little bit different from the organization to the high school. But the infrastructure remains the same. It's just the tools and the ways that you apply them that change and grow.
Yeah, well, having a son in high school and a daughter that's just gone off for her first semester at college, I can absolutely attest to the need for that. Not that they're doing anything wrong, but I do think that's something that isn't talked about or understood. When somebody's 18, they leave home and go to a completely different part of the country. They're 5 hours away or whatever, and suddenly thrown into a big apartment with people they don't know at all, or thrown into lessons they don't understand. It's the whole, gosh, do I really belong here? Are they doing what they can for me? Am I doing what I can for them? So 100%, that would be an amazingly powerful area to explore. But yeah, hey, get the first book out. Let's get that done. Don't let perfect be the enemy of wonderful. So I'm sure it's wonderful already. Don't think, it's got to be perfect though, because it's never going to be perfect.
Never going to be perfect.
Yeah. Let people experience it. But thank you so much for your time. You've been incredibly generous. And it was, not what I expected, but in a good way. It was much warmer than I thought it would be. Not that you don't look warm or you don't come across as warm, but it was very powerful in so much as you gave as much of yourself as that you did about the methodology, if that makes sense, in a very good way, which I think really helps it come across about just how important understanding what belonging really means. And I really understand it for the first time. So from a personal level, thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for co-creating it with me and with our listeners. And perhaps that just speaks to the depth of what we can achieve when we come together and become interdependent and co-create. So thank you for that. Yeah.
No, and I'll put lots of links to your website so people can find you and find your writings. It's a really good website. There's some really good resources there. So I would highly encourage people to sort of seek it out. So I look forward to seeing the book and to maybe sort of having you back on again one day to read about and talk about the next book when that comes out. So yeah, take care of yourself and your family. And,
thank you.
Yeah.
You as
good
well.
to meet you.
You as well.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you, Andrew.